The red shoes glow beneath the stage lights, their color fixed in the memory of cinema. In 1948, they carried Moira Shearer into a kind of immortality, where movement felt weightless and devotion to art looked absolute. Audiences believed they were witnessing the beginning of something endless. Yet almost as suddenly as she appeared, she began to step away. Invitations came from everywhere. The world wanted more roles, more films, more proof that such perfection could be repeated. Instead, there was silence. No scandal followed her. No dramatic farewell marked the moment. Only absence. And the quiet question that still lingers decades later. Why would an artist at the height of acclaim choose to vanish when the spotlight was brightest? Moira Shearer was not shaped by cinema, but by discipline. Long before the camera found her, she belonged to the world of classical ballet, trained to believe that perfection was earned through restraint, repetition, and silence. Born into a family that valued structure and control, she entered the royal ballet tradition with a seriousness that set her apart. When the red shoes arrived, it did not simply make her famous. It transformed her into a symbol of post-war British art, admired across Europe and beyond. Critics praised her as an ideal union of dancer and actress. Someone who seemed untouchable by doubt or fatigue. Awards, international attention, and the promise of a global career followed quickly. To the public, her future appeared perfectly mapped. Yet beneath this image of effortless grace was a life already moving in a direction few could see. A space was forming between who she was celebrated as and who she felt herself becoming. From the beginning, Moira Shearer understood movement as discipline rather than expression. Her childhood was shaped by routine, by the belief that the body must obey before it can speak. Ballet entered her life not as an escape, but as a structure she could rely on. Hours at the bar taught her control, precision, and an acceptance of solitude. Praise came early, yet it was never treated as comfort. It was treated as responsibility. She learned to endure long before she learned to perform. What drove her forward was not the promise of applause, but the pursuit of exactness. Every step had to be earned. Every role had to be justified. Unlike many who are drawn to the stage for visibility, she seemed motivated by disappearance into form, into line, into silence. Cinema was never the original destination. When film arrived, it felt almost accidental, a brief crossing between two worlds that demanded very different kinds of surrender. Ballet asked for devotion without witnesses. Film asked for permanence, for repetition, for a version of oneself that could be captured and replayed forever. Even at the start, this difference planted a quiet tension. Success did not change her direction. It only tested how far she was willing to bend without breaking. Fame arrived quickly, and with it came expectations that did not belong to ballet. Cinema demanded availability, flexibility, and visibility. Roles were offered not because they deepened her craft, but because the world wanted to see the same image again. The red shoes had created a figure larger than the dancer herself, and maintaining that image required compromise. Schedules grew heavier. Rehearsal gave way to promotion. Control over movement slowly shifted to control over appearance. For Moira Shearer, this shift carried a quiet cost. Ballet had taught her that art lived in the present moment, disappearing the instant it was complete. Film did the opposite. It fixed her movements in time, turning discipline into spectacle. The pressure was not only physical, but philosophical. To repeat perfection on command was to risk hollowing it out. Each new opportunity carried the unspoken demand to become more accessible, more explainable, more permanent. There were whispers of strain, of exhaustion, masked by elegance. Some spoke of injuries that never fully healed, others of a growing unease with the direction her career was taking. Nothing was ever confirmed, and perhaps that was intentional. What mattered was the imbalance forming beneath the surface. Success had expanded her reach but narrowed her sense of ownership. The very fame that promised freedom began to feel like a contract she had never agreed to sign. And in that space between recognition and restraint, the price of visibility became impossible to ignore. There was no single moment when everything collapsed. No headline announced a fall. Instead, the change unfolded quietly, almost politely. Invitations were declined. Projects were postponed, then abandoned. Names that once carried authority in cinema began to receive careful refusals. To the outside world, it looked puzzling. To those close to her, it felt inevitable. This period was marked not by excess, but by withdrawal. The body that had once obeyed without question now demanded limits. Pain was present, though rarely discussed. Whether it came from injury or exhaustion was never made clear. What became visible was distance. Distance from the industry, from its rhythms, from its need to define her again and again. The silence around her choices invited speculation, but she offered no clarification. Without scandal or confrontation, she stepped out of alignment with expectation. The world read this as disappearance. In truth, it was a refusal to continue on terms that no longer felt her own. This was not a collapse played out in public. It was a private reckoning, a moment when continuing would have meant losing something essential. And so the fall took shape as absence, leaving behind unanswered questions and a presence that faded without explanation. The end of her public life did not arrive as a conclusion, but as a quiet narrowing. Moira Shearer did not disappear from art. She simply removed herself from its loudest spaces. She returned to Scotland, where the stages were smaller and the audiences closer. Their performance was allowed to exist without documentation. No cameras followed. No recordings preserved the movement. What happened on stage was meant to remain there, carried only by memory. Those years were shaped by a deliberate restraint. She chose places where her work could breathe without being repeated, judged, or compared to a past image. A promise was often mentioned, though never explained. Something she would not break even if it meant stepping away from recognition. To some, this seemed like a retreat. To others, it felt like a reclaiming of control. When the wider world looked for her, it found only fragments. Occasional appearances, brief acknowledgments, no return to cinema. No attempt to rewrite the story that had already been fixed in the public imagination. Her life continued, but outside the frame that had once defined her. What remained was not an ending shaped by loss, but one shaped by choice. And that choice, carefully protected, would become as much a part of her story as the role that first made her unforgettable. What Moira Shearer left behind was not a catalog of films, but a singular imprint. The red shoes remained untouched by repetition, preserved as a moment rather than a phase. Dancers and filmmakers continued to reference her performance not because it defined a career, but because it stood apart from one. Her legacy resisted expansion. It refused to grow louder with time. There were traces of another story carefully guarded. A handwritten memoir existed spoken of, but never released. Those closest to her suggested it would alter how her choices were understood, how her silence might be read not as retreat, but as intention. Yet it remained sealed, reinforcing the distance she had always maintained between herself and interpretation. In the years that followed, her influence became quieter, but no less present. She was remembered less as a star who vanished, and more as an artist who set her own limits. In a world that rewards constant visibility, her absence became instructive. It asked whether legacy must always be built through accumulation or whether restraint could also leave a lasting mark. What endured was not an explanation, but a space. And within that space, her story continued to resonate without ever fully revealing itself. Fame often asks for permanence. It wants repetition, visibility, and access. Shadow offers something quieter. It allows distance limits and the right to remain unfinished. Moira Shearer lived between these two forces. She reached a height few artists ever touch, then chose not to climb higher. Not because she failed, but because she understood the cost of staying. Her story lingers because it resists resolution. There is no single truth to uncover, no final confession to explain everything. What remains is a tension between what the world wanted from her and what she chose to protect. In that tension, her silence becomes meaningful. It invites reflection rather than judgment. As you think back on her image on those red shoes frozen in time, consider what it means to step away before being consumed by expectation. Some stars burn until nothing is left. Others fade by design, leaving behind a different kind of light. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to share your thoughts, join the conversation, and follow the channel for more journeys into the lives behind the spotlight.